Good afternoon, and welcome to another session on this gender forum at UNCTAD 15. I am so pleased to welcome this set of panelists who will be speaking on the topic of accountability and advocacy. Who gets to sit at the negotiating table? I think this topic is really a little bit different from the others because we're talking now about translating policy into advocacy and negotiating positions. And with me are an esteemed panel from Asia Pacific, from Latin America and the Caribbean, who will help us think through some of these issues, especially in a context of UNCTAD, where trade negotiations and advocacy is the very meat and bones of the discussion taking place at UNCTAD now. My name is Dr. Yves-Remy. I am director at the Shridath Ramphal Center for International Trade Law Policy and Services. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of the panelists here today. With us are Wardarina from the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, Nicole Bidegain Ponte from the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Marsha Drakes from the CARICOM Office of Trade Negotiations. So they'll each speak for about 10 minutes, after which I will guide them through 2 or more questions, and then really turn the floor over to you, audience, for any questions or comments you'd like to make on their presentations. So we're going to start with Wardarina from the Asia Pacific Forum, and she will say her few opening remarks.
Thank you so much. And then also, first of all, I would like to say thank you for this opportunity to speak in this Gender and Development Forum of UNCTAD. I'm proud to speak not only on behalf of Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, but also on behalf of our more than 300 feminist members in 32 countries in Asia and the Pacific. Most of them are grassroots women organizations in the local and the national level. We are part of the feminist movements, but also our members part of the farmers' movements, fisher folks, women with disabilities, urban poor, rural and indigenous women, climate justice movements, Dalit women, women workers, migrant movements, and other people's movements. So in this session, I'm requested to speak on our experience on advocacy, sharing our thoughts on accountability, and then who gets to be at the trade negotiating table. So why grassroots movement to stand against RCEP? This trade agreement will definitely go into impacting women's human rights in many different aspects. One is undermining production of more affordable generic version of life-saving medicines. And then also negatively impact women farmers and indigenous women's rights to seed and food sovereignty, lock in privatization of public services, push women workers' wages even down, and then constrain creation of decent jobs, and also restrict the ability of governments to introduce industrial and fiscal policies that is actually necessary to protect and regulate in the public interest. So in this new post-pandemic reality or pandemic reality that we are still having now, these vulnerabilities will be further deepened and then marginalizing communities even more. And then it's like it is a race to the bottom with women at the bottom. So APWLD and our members, we have been doing a lot of organizing work in the ground. We do a lot of capacity building, we do advocacy, and also mobilization on the street. So we conduct feminist participatory action research, for instance, where the grassroots women themselves document the impact of trade and investment agreements to their lives and collectively build demands and strategies for advocacy and mobilization. We ensure that we build materials and resources to unpack the impact of these trade deals to women on the ground. We also engage inside and outside different rounds of negotiation, of trade negotiation. Like for instance, like organize people's meetings or People's Forum on RCEP organized capacity building workshop for women's rights organization and diverse people's organization to influence the process. We mobilize women, mostly women farmers, Dalits, fisher folks, workers and trade unions, rural and indigenous women to participate in the People's Forum and then different round of negotiations of RCEP. We also support national consultation, stronger presence and voices of these women's in public hearing in different countries, including with the parliamentarian. And also we locally based group with the movements against FTA, which is usually more based in the country's capital. So there are a lot of challenges, of course, in this advocacy space, most of it because it is very, very close negotiations, no access to document, limited space for civil society, including women's group. So for instance, in our case, in our advocacy, in RCEP, the different RCEP round of negotiation that we have sometimes only provide 1.5 until 2 hours time, only that, for the compared to the length of days they usually have their consultation, only 2 hours time for the stakeholder consultations with the RCEP negotiating countries. Sometimes civil society were promised to have more time to express their concern, but only to be cut off and then suddenly said they had less time. So for us, is this really the value of human rights and people's engagement and participation? Civil societies, media, parliamentarian, and even local government have been hardly given any access to this negotiation and in a process that already far from transparency. And then also, RCEP impacts more, I think, than 50% of the world's population and is being negotiated without the knowledge of this population. And then for many governments negotiating this, maybe this trade agreement might be about cost and benefit, about selling or buying, about letters and numbers. But however, for women and many other marginalized community, it is about our life and death. So most of the time, the statements and questions raised by these peoples and social movements are not responded at all by the governments. That's our experience, yeah. And then only to be noted or maybe tick the box exercise. So in contrast, while in Indonesia, for instance, while the Indonesian civil society were only given 2 hours of the stakeholder consultation, the Indonesian chambers of commerce and industry got the whole 2 weeks and have the chance to actually speak and negotiate with the negotiator and also the delegates. And then for one of the important point also to be noted that sometimes in our the availability of space really depends on the advocacy to the host countries that is actually hosting, the round of the negotiation. So this will be extra challenging when we are faced by more and more authoritarian governments and also repressive government that is now happening globally and also in our region in Asia and the Pacific. For us, it's also very clear that the provision of trade and investment agreement that are found to be inconsistent with the human rights obligation of government should be just revised or terminated. That's just the rule, right? And then the UN independent experts actually states that actually the state itself have appointed to ensure human rights are protected globally have already suggested that mega trade agreement like RCEP is violating human rights obligation, and many cases also violates national constitution. So we, the women, and also the people as sovereign power must know that these free trade deals really stand a free trade based on people's rights and needs, or rather it is to maximize corporate interest and power. So the negotiation and adoption that we had on RCEP indicate it's for the latter. It's very clear. as it is done completely in secrecy behind people's back while giving information and decision-making access to corporation. We really must end this political corporate hypocrisy. And then we have been saying that women have been at the heart of the movements to halt the deadly advances, for instance, of the WTO. We will use the same solidarity to stop any trade agreement, be the power to make decisions over our own lives and the future. I would like to end my speech a little bit by saying that, many times that we have heard this, that the argument saying that transparency will probably undermine the administration policy to complete the trade agreements because, the public opposition will be significant. Then for us, it's very, very simple, right? Like there's this group saying it, and then we are very, very agree. If the public wouldn't like it, then don't sign it. And then even more so, while so many governments acknowledge that these inequalities exist and globalization has widened the gap between the rich and the poor, especially in developing countries, they have also expressed their inability to reverse it. So if our governments recognize that this current system no longer works, and then why are we maintaining it? And then, thank you so much. That's the end of my speech.
Thank you so much, Wardarina, for these insightful remarks on the Asia-Pacific perspective. It's my great pleasure now to turn the floor over to Nicole Bidegain. She's a social officer in the gender division at UNCTAD, and she's going to talk to us, I guess, about accountability and data parity issues. So over to you, Nicole.
Thank you very much. I would like to share with you the following presentation of the work we have been doing within ECLAC to advance this agenda. First of all, I would like to share that in Latin America and in the Caribbean region, we have a very comprehensive regional gender agenda that has been adopted by ECLAC member states in the session of the Regional Conference on Women in Latin America since 1977. And from now on, the governments agreed on a very comprehensive agenda that has women's rights at the core of sustainable development, but also it's an agenda that really wants to promote not only the reduction of gender inequalities within countries, but also between countries. And there are specific commitments to advance cooperation, financing, and trade as a means for advancing women's rights and gender equality. Particularly on the area of trade, governments agreed, for instance, to conduct assessment on the impact of human rights and trade policies from a gender equality perspective, but also to promote the generation of quality employment and entrepreneurship opportunities in international trade. And something that for us that is really important, because in an interconnected world, the possibility to advance this agenda by specific countries is limited. There is a need for regional and international cooperations to avoid the race to the bottom. And that's why in the last conference on women in Latin America and the Caribbean, governments agreed to operate in a coordinated manner to avoid harmful competitions among countries and prevent that gender inequality is being used as a variable to increase export or attract investment. Also, there are specific commitments to advance and to analyze the extraterritorial impacts of policies and to advance the regional position at the global forums in terms of macroeconomic policies, trade, investment, and financial agreements. So with this normative framework, we have been working with different governments from the region to strengthen different strategies. First, that data collection and analysis on the links between gender and trade. Secondly, to support intersectional coordination, particularly between women's machinery and the Ministry of Women and Gender Equality, with foreign affairs ministers, with trade negotiators, but also with trade promotion agencies and sectoral ministers as the ministries of finance. And of course, not only to strengthen the intersectoral coordination within the state, but also to ensure that civil society participation, especially feminist organizations and women's organizations and movement, can be aware about the policies that governments are implemented and can follow up the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of these policies. So concretely, we are working with the government of Salvador on generation of gender and trade statistics in order to include a specific module in their gender equality observatory, but also we are doing capacity building activities with trade negotiators and also design gender responsive export promotion strategies. With the government of Chile and Uruguay, we are supporting them in the indicators to assess the implementation of the gender chapter of their bilateral agreement. As you may know, Chile has been a country that has promoted the inclusion of gender chapters in different trade bilateral and trilateral agreements. And now the challenge is how we can assess the implementation of these chapters in these agreements and take into account the different trade asymmetries between the different partners. And of course, we're also working on the regional dialogue as part of the regional conference on women. And for instance, in the last meeting, we promote a dialogue between the Minister of Finance of Barbados with the Vice President of Ecuador and authorities from the women's machineries and foreign affairs ministries of Panama and Chile and feminist organizations. And one of the things that we discuss in these spaces is the importance to understand that gender inequality in Latin America is at the root of the sustainable of the development model, and that we have 4 structural obstacles that are really eroding the capacity of countries to move towards substantive equality. And those obstacles are related to sexual division of labor, patriarchal cultural patterns, concentration of power, and socioeconomic inequality, which has been really deepened in the context of COVID crisis. And I would like to share with you some of the data that we have from the region. And one of the things that we said is that when we talk about international trade, it's important that we understand what are the gender inequalities in the labor market. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, only 1 in 2 women are related with the labor market. So what we have seen is that even if the women's labor market participation has increased in the last 20 years, is stagnant on the 50%. And due to the COVID-19 crisis, we see a setback of 18 years of participation of women in the labor market. And as you also can see, the women's unemployment has been systematically higher than men unemployment, and this has increased in the context of the crisis. And also it's really important for us to look at the gender labor market segregation in the region and where are women in these different sectors. And as we see in the context of the COVID crisis, the Caribbean, for instance, GDP fall in minus 7.5%. And 1 in 2 women in the Caribbean are employed in high-risk sectors of being impacted by job and income losses, particularly women working in tourism, which is also a sector that is very much impacted by the borders closures and the fall in the international demand of services. And secondly, for us it's really important to look at these links between gender labor market segregation and trade specialization, because when we also look at another region from Latin America, which is South America, we see that export, they are not really contributing too much to women's employment. And this is related to what Latin American region export, and is a strategy based on natural intensive resources and low value added manufacturing, which are not employment intensive, not for men, but less for women. And as we see, only 11% of women are are employed in export-related sectors. And we are taking here a very comprehensive understanding of this, and you will see that this figure is direct employment in the export sector, but also we are including indirect employment. And taking into account the external shocks of the COVID, what we see is that not only international trade in the region is not really job intensive, particularly in South America, and of course there are differences when we took a sectoral understanding of this process, but women are concentrated in very few sectors related to export, particularly textiles, clothing, but also tourism. And these are the sectors who has been more impacted in the context of the COVID crisis, particularly textile in Central America and Mexico, but tourism in, I think, in the whole region, but specifically in the Caribbean. And what we see is that even if in 2021, we are in a context of trade expansion, and then this is driven by demand of the US and China for commodities. So this is while trade figures has now been in a positive term, the problem is that we have a risk of primarization of our export orientation strategies. I also would like to share with you that this crisis also shown that the austerity paradigm can be challenged. And what we see in the figures we have in ECLAC is that the many countries implemented counter-cyclical policies, and this has been critical to ensure that the impacts on women's and on population are not, I mean, they're very severe, but it could be worse. And what we've seen is that there is an increase in subsidies and transfers, specific cash transfers, and for the 2021, already 20 countries announced or extended emergency transfers for 10 billion. So this is 0.26 of GDP, right? But for us, it's really important to analyze the distributional effect of these fiscal policies from a gender perspective, because a rise in spending do not automatically lead to a closing the gender gap. And that's why in ECLAC we are updating an observatory of COVID-19 measures implemented by countries in the region. And we have a specific section on to see what are the policies who have been implemented with a gender perspective. And we find some measures related to the care economy, to advancing policies to tackle gender-based violence. Also, the extension of some social protection measures that are targeted to women, and employment and income generation. And I would like to say that most of the measures we identify are related to the, not to sectors related to international trade, but it's important to say that in some countries in the Caribbean, some specific measures for the tourism sector or has been implemented, and women have benefited from some of them, while also other measures have been implemented to support women entrepreneurship and internationalization of their enterprises, such as trade promotion activities and promoting digital economy and digital trade. But just to finalize, I would like to say that even if these measures are very important, we need to think in how to move to a more transformative understanding of the recovery, while we are in the midst of an uncertainty and we really don't know how the region can move forward in this context of post-COVID. But there are some trends that COVID-19 has deepened, and so policies response and trade policies should be really transformative in order to move towards sustainability and equality orientation. And one of these trends, as I mentioned before, is the trend of primarization of export due to commodity prices, and also the increase of poverty and inequality that we have seen in the region, and particularly the overrepresentation of women within poverty and poor households. And so what are the recommendations? The need to move toward productive structures that are more diversified. So we can also diversify the export basket to more knowledge-intensive sectors and quality employment for women. Secondly, there is another trend related to the geopolitical tensions and change in the economic geography with some process of reshoring, nearshoring that we have seen, and some kind of regionalization of trade exchanges. So in this context, more than ever, it's really important to promote regional productive chains in key dynamic sectors that are key for sustainability of life, which is something that is core for the feminist economic analysis, and that in ECLAC we are trying to promote this understanding of the shift that economy needs to happen. So how we promote women's participation, workers and entrepreneurs in key productive chains related, for instance, to the healthcare manufacturing. So we are not Latin America do not only import all these healthcare manufacturing elements, but we are able to produce. And also when we talk about tourism, how we move to a more sustainable tourism that really can also help to reduce asymmetries and promote more positive spillover effects. Another trend is related to the crisis of multilateralism and the asymmetries between countries that we have seen, and we think UNCTAD is a very important global platform to reduce these asymmetries and to strengthen multilateralism. And in this context, for us, regional cooperation and global cooperation to avoid the race to the bottom, respect policy space, and promote coherence between trade and women's rights is fundamental. And finally, the digital economy and cross-border e-commerce is something that the COVID crisis has really deepened this trend. And there is a context of a boom of digital platform, but in the region, there is 4 of 10 women in the region are not connected and cannot afford connectivity. So there is a huge challenge in terms of how we close gender gaps regarding access to resources, market technologies, but also digital skills. And at the same time, we guarantee women's labor rights in the digital economy, avoiding any attempt of precarization of condition of life. So to end, I would like to say that with this analysis in ECLAC, we are promoting different proposals for a transformative recovery with gender equality, with one of the main areas, as I mentioned before, is women's participation in productive economic recovery. But secondly, is to promote an inclusive digital transformation. Thirdly, to advance to a care economy as a driver for recovery, but also in ECLAC, we are supporting this idea of transitioning towards a care society. And finally, we need a new fiscal compact for gender equality. And we need to reduce symmetries between states, between different actors, and to ensure that gender equality and women's rights are a key element for sustainable and transformative recovery. So to end, I would like to share with you some of the latest publications where we have been analyzing all these different trends, when we have our latest data and our recommendations. And I hope this is something you find interesting to continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that. I thought you went through quite a wide range of issues. Very many for us to digest. But one of the things that I'll probably get back to you on is the question of these wonderful recommendations and proposals. How do we actually translate these into actual negotiating positions in a WTO or in an UNCTAD context? Because I feel like sometimes that's where the gap is lying, you know, between the formulation of the principles and the proposals and actually the advocacy in these various types of negotiating fora. So I'm going to just plant that idea for you to think about as we move in studio to Marsha Drakes. Marsha is with me in this wonderful setting here in beautiful Barbados. Marsha, it's so great to see you again. We are going to now turn to you and ask you from more of a CARICOM perspective, because you among the trade negotiators that negotiate on behalf of CARICOM, how are you seeing the issue of trade and gender playing out in terms of accountability and advocacy on these issues in our various trade negotiating spheres?
Great. First, thanks so much for this unique opportunity. Thanks to the organizers. This is a wonderful time to join the conversation, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to do so. Now, there are a few points first that I think are necessary to get out there, because they kind of set the context for understanding what gender justice advocacy and accountability ought to be in the context of CARICOM's negotiations of its external trade agreements with its trading partners. And the first thing that I think we need to take into account is the structure and nature of the process that is involved in CARICOM's negotiation when it does so with, negotiates with external trade partners. Now, in accordance with community law under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, the CARICOM member states are expected to coordinate their external trade policy. And that includes pursuing external trade agreements with third states on a joint basis. Now, what that means, therefore, is that any governmental decisions about which partner to target, what do you want to achieve from engaging with that partner in terms of a trade negotiation, all the things related to strategies, the appropriate strategies to get what is desired, and even what is understood of what the region should give in return to that trading partner. Those types of decisions are calculated on the basis of an overall balance of interests amongst all the CARICOM member states, and not just relate to the interests of any single member state. So it's about the collective, right? And as you appreciate, even though the CARICOM member states may have similar profiles, economic profiles, they're not homogenous. And so there's a certain give or take in terms of arriving at what should the region seek to obtain from its trading partner in the context of a trade negotiation. So it's kind of fluid that way, and not everything that is desired by any specific member state will necessarily feature in the final outcome of that balance of interest, right? So there's a certain degree of give or take. Those interests that are to be pursued are then later expressed in what is understood as the negotiating mandate. And that guides the negotiations from inception right up to the very end, the conclusion of the negotiation with the trading partner. How member states make decisions about what should constitute that negotiating mandate is informed by a consultation process with a wide range of stakeholders, both economic, commercial type of stakeholders, as well as social stakeholders. And that consultative process takes place at the national level. And when it comes to the national level, the governments are responsible for facilitating that process. But it also takes place importantly, because remember, this is about a regional coordination. This is about a joint basis amongst the member states. So there's also a regional consultative process that's absolutely necessary. And that is facilitated and coordinated by my office, the Office of Trade Negotiations of the CARICOM Secretariat. So to begin to answer this question of who ought to sit at the negotiating table, it's a bit of a misnomer, because it's not so much about who gets to be in the room or who gets to sit at the table. In fact, it's more about who participates in the consultative process, who participates at the national consultation level, and who participates at the regional consultation level is critical, because that is how interest groups, using this consultative process, that is how interest groups are afforded the opportunity to shape and influence what is what interests are going to be articulated in terms of a negotiation with an external trade partner. It shapes what is ultimately pursued as the collective interests of the region. That's how you influence it. So through the consultative process, stakeholders, interest groups, that is how you're going to end up trying to shape the contours of the negotiating mandate. So, but who sits at the actual negotiating table are really just persons with certain levels of competencies, of course, that have been appointed by the member states to faithfully represent those interests, those regional interests that have already been predetermined through a consultative process. Okay? But ultimately, it's the government that makes that decision about what filters as the final composition of those interests in the negotiating mandate. So that's the reason that the more effective interest groups are at participating in national and regional consultation processes, the more likely you'll be able to shape what interests are represented as a regional position in the context of a trade negotiation with a trading partner. So recognizing that, what does this mean now for gender justice advocacy and accountability in terms of trying to, in the context of a trade negotiation, try to pursue the promotion of gender justice as an outcome of a negotiation and as reflected in the final agreement at the end of the day. Well, as I alluded to before, given that the governments of the region ultimately make that decision about what should be pursued in the negotiation, civil society organizations which represent these interests of gender justice and gender equality need to be mindful that it is the governments that they need to persuade about the importance of the issue and its nexus, the critical nexus between gender justice, gender equality, and trade and economic development on a sustainable basis and on an inclusive basis. Therefore, in terms of responsibility, civil society organizations have this distinct responsibility to ensure that on behalf of their stakeholders, that they do engage with the governments to the extent possible in articulating those interests effectively to the government. And I can tell you that this needs to take place long before any decision is taken to engage in a trade negotiation with a third state. Civil society organizations need to work assiduously at first, establishing that rapport with governments and also maintaining that level of dialogue and engagement with government so that they can be recognized and identified from the outset as an important interest group, as an important stakeholder. And then in doing so, then you get on the government's radar. The government knows that is the go-to. I know what the business they're in. I understand that the critical issue that they represent. And then in terms of when the consultation process is being organized, then it is clear. There's no confusion about who should be targeted to be included in the consultative process. Once the negotiations start and the formal consultation process begins, it's critical that the civil society organizations maintain their participation in the consultative process. And they have to be active and vocal and constructively so. They have to do that because recognizing that some negotiations can take years from inception to conclude. And while that can be exhausting in a sense, it doesn't necessarily require a lot of resources, but it requires a high degree of organization. And the point is that civil society organizations need to be prepared to engage for the long haul in that consultative process, because that is how you continue to have the opportunity to shape what actually goes on in the negotiating room. On another note, it is also important that as part of that process of organized interest articulation, that the civil society organizations need to network, not only with stakeholders at the national level, but there's a need to ensure that they're also networking and collaborating with stakeholders, similar stakeholders across the region, because what must evolve from their interest articulation is in fact a regional position. What must be posited is a regional position. So therefore, working in national silos is suboptimal and must be avoided at all costs, because again, the process is about a regional coordination. And therefore, the positions that are posited need to reflect that regional posture and not just be that of a national position. It's also important that we remember that not everything that is desired will actually necessarily emerge in the negotiating mandate. The organizations may posit a number of arguments, a number of proposals, a number of positions, but in the final analysis, and in terms of determining what an overall balance of interest is, not all, or sometimes in some cases it may not feature at all, but the point is that not all of what you desire may in fact be reflected in the final outcome. And certainly when you engage in the negotiations with the third party, it's possible that none of what you wanted would have made the final cut, because even that outcome, which is the final trade agreement, has to reflect a balance of interest between the two sides. So recognizing that what the other side is willing to do is just as important as convincing your regional governments about the importance of gender justice and its nexus to trade and trade development. There's a need to make a concerted effort to align interest groups from the region with similar interest groups, even from who might be of origin in the trading partners jurisdiction. By doing so, by forming these alliances, some useful things can emerge. First of all, these allies within the trading partners jurisdiction could help provide critical and important insights about the trading partner, how they see and how they treat with gender justice in their trade agreements. And such insights could also assist our own civil society organizations to develop and suggest strategies as how to get to yes in the negotiations, how to persuade the trading partner to accept the proposals and the positions that are being posited and presented by CARICOM in the negotiating room and at the table. Similarly, working with such allies in the jurisdiction of the trading partner could help, especially when it comes to lobbying, create political pressure on the government of the trading partner's government to be more open to accepting or considering CARICOM's own proposals on these same matters, because often what you'll find in a number of countries, the lobbying effort of the lobbying interests for these types of disciplines like gender justice and stuff like that are very powerful. They exert quite a degree of influence on their governments through years of lobbying, years of a sophisticated way of putting that political pressure on them. And we need to be prepared to tap into that and leverage that same political pressure in order to help get what we want, as what the interest groups would have articulated would be necessary to come out of a trade negotiation. I want to bring up an important point about the need to have your arguments being supported by empirical evidence and not just anecdotal or conjecture. Relevant data collection is something that the region struggles with across the board. It's not unique to this region, but it's certainly something that the region is challenged by, and it undermines a lot of the research and work that needs to go in terms of preparing for a negotiation itself, the technical process of preparing for a negotiation. I think civil society organizations have an important role to play in bridging and closing those information and knowledge gaps through their own collaboration, particularly with academia, to try to ensure that knowledge gaps don't undermine the cogency of the arguments that you're going to be putting forward as it relates to the pursuit of gender justice in trade agreements. You don't want, because when there are information gaps, when there are data gaps, it compromises the credibility of the positions as they're being articulated, whether it's to persuade your regional governments about the importance of it when they're trying to just come up with a negotiating mandate, and even further down the line when you're in the negotiation trying to convince the other side. It also makes the job a lot easier for the negotiators. It creates a better confidence in being able to provide irrefutable proof about the linkages and why to justify the interventions that might be being proposed at that time. So information, critical. Empirical evidence, critical. And civil society organizations have a role to play, I think, in helping with that. I think, too, in terms of accountability, that civil society organizations also need to express to their governments clearly a legitimate expectation to continue to be updated about the status of negotiations. And the consultative process also facilitates that in a number of ways, because there are a number of reporting mechanisms that are built into that consultation process. And but interest groups have a legitimate expectation to be kept apprised by their governments about what's going on. And in doing so, that kind of information will allow you to not only monitor how the trading partner is receiving or reacting to the proposals being tabled, but it also allows for an opportunity to develop or tweak strategies as to how to get to yes, tweak strategies in terms of maybe there might be a need to adjust the proposal to make it more palatable, but still stay to the core of what is desired to secure the outcome.
We're going to have to wrap up so we can get to the questions.
For one last thing I want to say is that apart from the negotiation process is another important part about what a trade agreement actually is. And the real remit of a trade agreement is, at the end of the day, to improve trade relations between the parties, but primarily through trade liberalization, removing barriers to trade. So it is important that advocates for gender justice use gender analyses, conduct gender analyses to find out and identify across all areas of economic activity where the promotion of gender justice might be necessary and important, and decide what type of intervention would be most appropriate in terms of treatment within negotiations themselves. How should trade liberalization be manipulated in order to serve the promotion of gender justice in that way? Should a particular economic activity be shielded from foreign participation? Or would it be better served to open up the sector, because your own sectors, because foreign participation would be considered helpful? On the other hand, is it that you want to seek opportunities of market openness in the trading partners market to provide certain types of gendered economic opportunities as might be identified? And so those are the types of questions, and you can only do that if you're engaging in that type of gendered analysis, gendered economic analysis. And but it's critical. But the final point I'll leave you with is that just like other trade-related issues, I think there's room for the integration of gender justice as a legitimate trade-related issue, and to treat with that in trade agreements. And that further work needs to go on in terms, and innovation, in fact, needs to go on in terms of how do we improve that nexus? How do we allow trade agreements, given what they are, bear in mind that their inherent limitations, however, and to use them constructively to help promote gender justice and gender equality.
Thank you for these remarks as well, Marsha. I feel like we've had a conversation there. There are some intersecting themes, but we got sort of perspectives from different vantage points. I think, for instance, Nicole's presentation helped us understand some of the data. I mean, that was something you mentioned, Marsha, some of the data underpinning the trends that would then feed towards solid negotiating positions. I think we also looked at the export-oriented sectors, right, Nicole, that were particularly impacted by COVID, and how women and women's issues stand to be affected by these broader macroeconomic trends, and how that ultimately affects women's empowerment and women's economic issues in areas such as the digital economy, in the care economy, and thinking more about how ultimately a post-COVID agenda must seek to contribute towards women and women's recovery in the context of these broader trends. And I think, Marsha, what you helped us to think through a little bit is how exactly it is that you feed these positions in a negotiating context, that there's a broader sort of art and strategic approach towards funneling women's issues into hardcore negotiating positions. So I'm going to throw out to all three panelists two questions, and given the limitations of time, I'm actually going to give you the option of choosing which one you want to answer, and we only have a few minutes, so it's really one of the two. The first one is, I think we heard from Asia, from the Caribbean and Latin America, there are different sort of levels of sophistication or levels of data underpinning negotiating positions that can be taken. And I think, drawing from your experience, either in collecting the data or articulating the positions, how do we formulate stronger in your areas of expertise? How do we allow for stronger positions to be taken in these negotiations from your perspective that are able to put these issues front and center? And then the second question that I have is, how do we do that in the context of these negotiations at UNCTAD? If there were one or two positions that you think are necessary, put a line in the sand to advance women's issues in the context of the outcome document at UNCTAD, what, from your perspective, would that be? One of these two questions. I'll start with you, Wardarina.
All right, thank you for that questions. Actually, governments are starting to recognize that trade agreements may have a first impact on women's human rights, and also UNCTAD, and then a lot of civil society. But some bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements is now included the new gender equality chapters. But I think for us, it's not enough. There are too many provisions in the trade agreements that really pose a danger to women to remedy it only with the gender equality chapter. It is increasingly recognized that trade agreement must undertake, this is very important, an ex ante and ex post gender audits, as well as human rights impact assessment if they are to serve the peoples. So the current trade agreement, human rights, gender, or even economic impact assessments, a full impact assessment will identify multiple potentially gender and human rights consequences of these trade deals. And then also a gender chapter, we think, can salvage the agreement. However, people-centered trade agreement based on solidarity is in that context of the gender equality chapter will need to include as the following in the minimum, as the minimum. One, to actually ensure that all state parties must ratify CEDAW and then optional protocol to CEDAW. All parties should adopt, maintain, and implement laws, regulation, and any other measures to fulfill their obligation under CEDAW. And then 3, remedies shall be made available to women who suffer discrimination or other human rights violation as a result of these actions of investor, which must include civil and criminal sanctions. And then nothing in the agreement shall apply to or restrict measures that a party adopts or maintains in their efforts to comply with CEDAW, and measures taken to comply with the gender chapter shall be excluded from us. What we see that how to make it at the center. And then, of course, to really ensuring that the feminist organization, women's rights organization, able to have the system and modalities to engage in this process. That's it.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to ask Nicole, which of these would you like to tackle in the 5 minutes you have left?
Regarding the first question, I think it's really key to break the glass ceilings that we have within the states. So national statistical officers can be can inform part of the negotiators' teams about what are the gender analysis and data available in the country and the region to articulate a position. But also, it's really important that women's machineries and women's ministries are also in preparing this position, and gender experts should be part of negotiating teams, because not only the gender chapters are important on this agreement, but there are many trade provision in other chapters related to intellectual property rights, related to public procurement, about access to services that are key for women's lives. And so all this data is really important to ensure that the trade agreement is coherent with the guarantee of women's rights and advancing gender equality. So with this information is the basis to ensure that, for instance, there is a specific indication about market access in specific sectors that are key for women, or maybe think about reservations. And when we talk not only about the offensive traits, but also about the defensive arguments, but which will be some of the areas that will not be part of this trade liberalization process, because are key, for instance, for the domestic, for women access to public procurement, or specific for some industries that are in a nation that needs at least some of the protections to later on be able to compete in the international market. So for me, the second issue is that many governments has a lot of information that they're not using. And so in ECLAC, we are trying to help them to assess what are the strengths of their own data and what are the possibilities to expand this data and to ensure that the data is available and known and understood by the different actors that participate in the trade negotiation process, so they are empowered about this information and they take informed decisions. And thirdly, I think what was really mentioned by Marsha is really important that women's organizations engage not only in a formal consultation process, but that are part of a substantive participation engagement through all the process. And so the different actors from civil society can be engaged in the whole process of trade negotiations, and of course later on in assessing in the implementation of this agreement and the importance for advancing women's rights at national level, but also between countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. And I really hate to have tried to cut it short, but I think we really appreciate your input. Thank you so much. And over to you, Marsha.
I'll be brief. I just want to pick up on something that she just said about governments and having a lot of data, but they're not using it. I'm not necessarily sure that in CARICOM's sense that is necessarily the case in all areas. I think it's about relevant data and perhaps the metrics and the of that collection might not be as tuned as they ought to be in order to serve, to fit the purpose, to serve the agenda of being able to identify where gender justice promotion would be necessary and how to fit that in. So sex aggregated data, I think, would be an important component of that. And this is where civil society needs to come in and say where the weaknesses are and identify where the weaknesses are in terms of data collection. And so that it can be used in more constructively and more empirically to help design a trade agreement that in fact can lead to women's empowerment, can lead in fact to rebalancing on gender relations, can in fact lead to gender justice. So that is what I would say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And now in the remaining time, we're going to open the floor to the audience to ask any questions that they may have.